Hello, everyone. Welcome to the J3U podcast. I am your host, John Jewett. With me is co-host Luke Miller. And today we bring you massive arm training. Welcome to the gun show. How's it going, Luke?
Good, man. I think there's a reason I have a hoodie on covering mine up because they're still not a strong point yet, but they're getting there.
Oh, I got my hoodie on too. It must be winter in Texas.
I know.
It's a freezing, 50 something degrees. Ridiculous. I went out for my morning walk this morning. I like shorts, so I have my shorts on, but I have my sweatshirt and a hoodie on. I'm walking, I'm like, I probably didn't need all this. And I know anyone that's like up north that saw that, like, would see me wearing this, be like, this is ridiculous.
I'm such a wimp. So I have started doing my morning steps on the treadmill because it's too cold to walk to Starbucks in the morning because I don't want to like dress up in sweats and shit. So I just do my steps and then drive to get my coffee.
And the thing about it is you get iced coffee, so it's not it's like you could be on a journey to like this hot beverage, right? But no, it's like cold to cold, colder back home.
So yeah, I've changed the morning routine a little bit.
Yeah, in mine, I'm still coming like post show. I used to like have some fasting period and then do all my steps in and cardio, and now it's like the idea kind of switched. Like I just want to get enough movement for the day and get my meals in, because now my meals are starting to like be a little bit larger and they're easier for me to accumulate at the end of the day. Which on prep you're like, well, I'll make sure I won't be hungry later on. But now it's like, oh man, my meals are getting too close together. So having to rearrange the schedule. So I might go on a short walk when I get up just to get outdoors and move, and then come right back home and get my first meal in.
Yeah. Well, we got to figure out how to get bigger arms.
Yes. Let's dive into it. So, Luke, my arms are weak. Help me. I think it's a pretty common body part that people want to be addressed.
Yeah.
And I think it's across the board. Even like when I first started training, like, oh, I want big arms, you know? So like we're in t-shirt season and tank tops, see your arms, know you train. I think within that, a lot of people, it's not a weak body part. And I don't mean to come across as like rude or anything, but there's overall development that needs to happen, right? It's not that arms are weak. It's kind of like, well, everything's kind of weak. We just need some overall size. And I think once you go to like start looking at more contest photos, looking at more physiques, you start to see like the imbalance that might be there. And it's really hard for people to pick out that on themselves.
Yeah. For me, where it stands out the most is when you pull up into like a front double, and like people don't typically pull that out as like their initial assessment. It's like one of the big things I'm looking on a front double is like tricep hang, especially from like a back double. Are we seeing that external rotation that allows to show it? And I think it kind of starts to become a relative game, kind of like you said, like where are the arms relative to the physique in a lot of these poses. And then kind of going from there based on your programming on that. But I definitely think go ahead.
No, I think you're right. Like, and truly like the front double is such an exposing pose, because there's a lot, the lats, the chest, all those are like lengthened out a lot. So if you're not round, like you're not really going to be able to hide it there. Legs, obviously you're not, it is what it is. They're straight on. And then that also gives a pretty good display of the arms. So you really show, I think, in that pose, where you would really have any imbalance. And if you're like, oh, wow, no, I really don't have any lats or chest. It's like, well, okay, maybe we should think about before we allocate a whole day just to arms and take that away from these other body parts. But, you're right. It's like a pose for pose assessment, front double, rear double, side chest. That's a big display of the whole side of the arm. How's it look in relation to the shoulder? How chest, hamstring hang, is all that in place? Or is it just truly like you just want big arms, but you just already have a balanced physique anyway?
Yeah.
So I think first off, I get that rules that out. So this is not for you. If you have like just a balanced, relatively balanced physique and you need a lot more stage weight, well, that should be your focus, not on arm training. Now, if you truly have an imbalance where arms you've been putting on good size, which I think if you should be a few years down the road of putting on overall growth before you're like, okay, arms are not moving at the same rate. What do I do from there? And I think starts to shift that design around how we would program training. I think there's a lot of like common issues that I currently like. Why is the body part weak? And it's addressing a lot of the issues we see and just poor training as well.
Yeah.
Do you have some that immediately come to your mind?
I think it's just like a lack of use of things that would allow you to be accurate. Like we went over this in the applied hypertrophy module about like choosing exercises that are going to allow you to drive tension directionally where you want it. So it's like the commonality of how common do you see fucking barbell curls and a skull crusher on an easy bar, right? It's like,
Yeah,
from an alignment standpoint and being able to drive tension where you want it, like the amount of torque that's going through the elbow, which is one of the biggest problems we see is elbow pain with arm training, is like, yeah, we probably have a list of exercise that would be better options than the ones that we're choosing. And so a lot of times it'll come down, not only to execution, which I'm sure we're going to get into, but just starting with choosing the right exercise, right? Like before we even get into some of the execution pieces, like choose the ones that allow that person to get into the position that they need to in order to drive hypertrophy and tension to the target tissues.
yeah, I think that's a great assessment point of someone that's, because my first inclination or what you might see just in someone like, hey, I need more arms, I'm going to do more arm training and more volume, and that might just create more of an issue that's occurring. It doesn't mean, we know more doesn't always equal more growth. It might mean more connective tissue stress and joint stress. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like the right exercises need to be in place, and that's going to give you longevity within your training blocks, and that longevity will create the growth you need. Because my issues when I've been doing more arm work, usually it's, for me, arms grow pretty quickly, and I'm doing more pressing and pulling, but it's the same issues that occur with a lot of arm training, is that connective tissue stress. So I'll get like medial epicondylitis, or like golfer's elbow, in those forearm flexors, getting really irritated from all like the curl work, and it's rowing. And then also I'll get some just pain like right at the tip of my elbow from tricep pressing. But what I found is that, for one, I'm picking movements that didn't align well and that bind joints, and I'm still forcing those movement patterns to occur. And that just accumulates a lot of connective issues. So with arm training, yeah, it's definitely getting in positions where you can actually execute and be in a point where you can drive tension, and not have all the joints binding and causing a lot of stress. And it's just what we go over in our like applied hypertrophy module of how to assess and set that up. I think, starting within that, increasing set quality, for one, I mean, start with biceps or triceps, I wouldn't care.
Yeah, I think with biceps, you just have a lot of opportunities to create braces that would allow the quality to be high, right? Like preacher curl variations, even like with a regular curl, like I've had people just leaning up against a preacher bench where their elbows have to touch like the whole time, like doing it unilateral, kind of keeping it some sort of like touch sensation that forces position to stay where it needs to be. And you can avoid a lot of the issues that are typically we see with bicep training, which is just shoulder involvement of some sort, whether it be, pulling a shoulder forward, elevation shrug type of a thing with like a drag curl type of a curl variation or something along those lines. And it's typically around limiting shoulder involvement for most people.
Yeah, you don't want to be turning this thing like into some type of weird power clean variation, which you see, right? Guys swinging, and this is like maybe some older thought of certain bodybuilding segments of like just sloppy curls, right? Big weight, moving it with some sloppy shitty form, and you're moving a lot of weight, but how are you moving all that weight? Well, getting going with the lower back and the quads, and then having shoulder finish it, and then there's a little bit of bicep in there somewhere. So yeah, I think taking the non-movers out and creating that brace, it would be very, very beneficial for a lot of people. I mean, obviously it's like, hey, it's the biceps. What does it do? It flexes the elbow, a little bit of shoulder flexion. We have like I mean, it's pretty minimal, but it's not going to be to where we're having to really, if you have your curl and you move a little bit at the shoulder, it's not a huge deal that I'm going to make. But for the most part, this is going to be just moving at the elbow alone and trying to lock every single joint otherwise in place. The feet, knees, hips, shoulders, lock everything down to where you only move across the joint where that muscle takes action. And then where that muscle taking action, where other planes can we need to work in? So with the biceps, with the arm by the side, potentially some type of like abducted, externally rotated position. Like, I mean, you could do like, Luke's showing us his cable crossover. I mean, you could do a cable crossover, or like even a preacher curl is basically the same idea. You're kind of opened up in that position. The upper arm is braced, and it gives you some really good stability. Of course, hey, I know we talked about this, knocking out like a functional shoulder stability aspect with the cable crossover. Getting in that position of having to like stabilize the shoulder on your own and curl, but then you have to justify if you have really poor shoulder stability, you're also probably going to not create a very good bicep output doing that.
I think it comes to where you put it, right? Like not putting output exercise. It's like putting it in that prep work where you're gaining that access to here before you even start the session, if you know you're going to be exposed somewhere in this plane. So like commonly that would be thinking more in a push setting, like using this to gain external rotation access. So we're having to press overhead, then we're doing that rather than like an actual movement within training.
Yeah, that's starting to get down a whole other.
Let's not go down that route.
Path. It does bring up a point that I'm going to write down and make sure that I hit on at some point talking today of just shoulder stability, because it's an issue. But anyway, so for biceps, within any of these curls exercises that we do, want to make sure, like I say, do the curl motion before you even get to the machine or the dumbbell, whatever it may be, and look at that arm path and where your wrist and elbow and shoulder are set up in a comfortable position. Whatever machine you get in, whatever curl you do, you want to be able to stay in that position. So if a lot of bodybuilders really suck getting externally rotated and curling with the palm directly up. Usually it's some type of a like slight internal rotation. And if you curled just standing there, it would kind of like come over to the other pec, like kind of this kind of a cross body curl, right?
Yeah.
And then you get in the easy bar that forces you in this position, and you're like, there's some awkward motion there. Like it's usually really hard to lock out. And if you fatigue, you'll see it like their pinkies start coming down and they're just like holding. This is me. And I'm like holding it by just my thumbs, and my elbows are out. I'm like, I'm not really doing a bicep curl anymore. It's kind of like more of this hammer curl variation. So I think that's an assessment point. Like, how do you curl just standing there? Find a way to do that through whatever means you need to. So whether like Luke and I both like the single arm dumbbell curl with like a lean to that side to where you can line up the shoulder, elbow, and wrist directly at a 90 to the ground. That way that bicep is lined up perfectly and you can align your joints really well. If you're like that type of bodybuilder that does the cross body curl, you can do that same setup with like a cable curl too. Yeah. And essentially what's nice with the cable curl too is you can kind of adjust in that motion where you want the peak tension or let it off a little bit as like an extra note there. So I'd say, hey, starting off, we probably want some type of curl, arm by the side, something that loads kind of mid-range, which a dumbbell would be great still option, or even a cable would be good option too. From there, the bicep also curls with the shoulder in some flexion. It aids a little bit in flexion. So like we said, a preacher curl is another great variation that we both really like. So those are some two primary ones for, I would say.
Yeah, those would be primary.
Yeah.
And then considering something a little bit more in shoulder extension, like some sort of stretch position curl, like an incline cable or even an incline dumbbell, even though technically the profile is not the greatest, but and then something within like a neutral for like a brachioradialis, right? Like a hammer curl variation of some sort.
Yeah, and the same principles apply that we just talked about. How do you curl just standing there without any load, and find a way to do that? So it can be a dumbbell hammer curl. As far as like it being cross body or not, that's going to really, I think, dictate just by how you would curl just standing there. So you might already be curling kind of cross body, and so you just move into a neutral grip and do your hammer curl in that variation.
Yep.
Reverse curls.
Yes.
Radialis. Huh?
It's a good old forearm work.
Yeah. Do you do much for like reverse curling?
No. I get so beat up. I get to the point where it affects my back training if I do it too much.
Gotcha. I will typically just stick with a hammer curl. I feel like that hits enough brachioradialis on top of all the other training. I do find, and my issue with the medial epicondylitis, the golfer's elbow, was that wrist flexors are overworked and my wrist extensors were kind of underworked. So, I mean, although there's a lot of curling that I do, which trains the brachioradialis, my just like wrist extensors don't get a lot of training. And we're always in that kind of like flex position. So I will do on my bicep days, like dumbbell wrist extensions, more of like a prehab thing than a hypertrophy thing. But hell, if they get bigger too, I won't complain. So usually my last bicep exercise, I will like superset those to where it kind of be knock a little bit extra out as well. Going between, I'll hang my like forearm off like a preacher bench with dumbbells and just do it that way. Or I guess if you had like a wrist roller, but I don't really like the wrist roller. It's like moving around and you're like flailing your arms around, or you have to stand on something. And so I just do it with the dumbbells perfectly fine. So anyway, yeah, I think those would be, making sure that you're aligned in all those exercises that you choose. And those would be your kind of your three that would really knock everything out, right? Standing supinated bicep curl. Oh, I guess that's a point. Would you move from a neutral to a supinated grip in the curl?
No.
I would keep it supinated and then let the neutral grip hammer curl take care of that aspect. And then a preacher curl, then something like with the shoulder behind you or upper arm behind you, like an incline bench curl, or like I said, we had that single arm cable curl you could do and kind of get in that same position, right?
Yeah.
So I know I mentioned that first, but a standing dumbbell curl, preacher curl, then like a single arm cable curl with that arm a little bit more behind you. That covers pretty much all functions of the bicep in different shoulder positions.
Yeah, and I think the piece that ties this all together is just understanding that as you move into movements that align better or a little bit stricter with form, progressions within the logbook and an acute standpoint is probably needed to be a little bit more patient, just because of how isolated the action is. I see a lot of people get very frustrated with like type A need logbook to progress now type of thing. It's like, hey man, if you did 14 reps last week and you got 14 this week and attempted a 15th, like that's still progress, right? Like even if you didn't complete the 15th. So it's a little bit more on the patient side with logbook progressions and looking at the month to month trends rather than the I just say that because I see a lot of people get aggravated with it.
No, you're completely right. I mean, a lot of these just load very light. Like think about a cable curl, like it's like 30 pounds on your cable curl. And the next one up is like, oh man, drop off 4 reps or something, So
yeah,
you're right. Like just because the logbook is not moving doesn't mean there's not, good stimulus occurring and adaptation occurring. You might notice like, oh, the 8th rep felt a little bit easier this time. And I think even jumping between rep ranges helps as well, just to space out. If you have an issue looking at the logbook every time and not seeing stuff move, like 1 week hit 15s, then the next week you can move to 10s, and then you rotate those rep range patterns or movements if you want, just to have some time to actually see the gauge and needle move. Now, it depends on your level. So we're talking about someone that's probably in the intermediate stage or even
Yep.
the advanced stage, and all your other movements are probably moving maybe every other week. Maybe stuff are just, it takes several weeks to really move. So arm training, yeah, this might be something that's going to take several weeks, or even might even be block to block where you're seeing that change increase. But it doesn't mean to do more, because I know we talked about like, hey, I'm recovering great. You should see performance improvement. If not, then maybe you need to be training a little bit more. With arms, you need the time to be able to truly assess that. I think, like Lou said, it's probably more so block to block where you really need to assess it.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think that brings us to triceps. Yeah.
Yeah, triceps. So
Lovely.
yeah, common issue, at least within for me, like I mentioned, was elbow pain and picking the wrong movements, or movements that were great to start and then they just
Oh,
end
yeah.
in catastrophe, which it's like this a skull crusher, because I get a great tricep, output out of it. I get pumped. There's a ton of like distortion in the muscle, but after like 6 weeks, they're just elbows are beat to shit, and then I have to take like another 6 weeks off of even barely training triceps. So, yeah, picking the right exercise is off the bat of what is within your ability is so important. And the same thing goes with biceps. How do you move without under any load? What is your access in those positions? And then finding movement patterns that fit within that.
And I think that's an interesting point because I run into a similar issue. You probably saw in the forums, I had to pull the skull crusher that I had in my plan for a different variation. It's just like a movement I get a lot out of, but it's like, man, I got like 10 weeks of runway and that's it before I'm having to pull it and it's affecting other things. So I think like that comes to what are the main hitters with the movement selections that we're choosing. So big fan of some sort of compound pattern for sure, whether that's a JM press, close grip press, dip of some sort. When mitigating elbow pain there, I see a lot of value in either doing like an end range extension to like prime elbow joints and get triceps firing at a pretty high level. Not as like a work type of a thing, just as like a getting into that position, like an isometric hold. Or even taking it as far as doing work sets before. But the reason I don't go down that route is trying not to throttle performance on the compound variation for most people. And then we're kind of getting into push down variations and maybe some sort of skull that's going to be a little bit easier on the elbow joint.
Yeah, so I think within the context of what your needs are development wise for a compound movement, if you can kind of knock out two birds with one stone, that's pretty ideal. So if you need triceps and chest, okay, well, we could do a close grip bench press and hit a little bit on both ends of that. Or if you needed like triceps and delts, well, hey, maybe we could do some type of incline pressing, close grip variation, or that might even be the same thing with like a dip, which I would lean more towards probably delt and triceps on a dip, depending on how you set it up. But regardless, yeah, picking that compound movement, you can get a lot out of it. And like you said, like it's nice to have a path to really load a lot over time and see some good progression with. So it does give you a lot of runway within that movement pattern. Now, some people are going to be very dominant pressers and maybe certain muscle groups over others. So maybe it's still not enough tricep stimulus. And that's when you need that extra isolation work in place.
Yeah.
Which, I think ideally loading something when the muscle's stretched is going to have potentially more of a hypertrophy stimulus there and cause that adaptation you want. However, that's also a lot of why people get a lot of elbow issues. So depending on the application, if you're doing something like after all your press work, you could probably go right into like a stretch position tricep work. You might still have the issue and you might need to do some push downs first. It just depends. Or if we're talking just on arm day, which we'll get into the split design here in a second, then you might need to do like more pre-activation or just warming up basically in a push down and not having it be your true work sets. But again, I don't think it's a huge issue if those need to be your work sets, and that's going to keep you sustainable over your long period off season. If that's what does, well, that's has a lot more value than just only getting 8 weeks to where like, oh, now my elbows are beat up and I need to switch it back. So that comes in like your own individual needs of what you need to program. But again, with any of these positions, it's still where do you have your own ability to align well with. So within like a push down position, same thing goes with our biceps, as most bodybuilders like kind of move in a elbow extension position, which is not directly at the side. So like a cross body is really what most of the time I see, and actually how I stay really comfortable with that little bit of internal shoulder rotation, which if you have like a prime bar setup for a push down, and it allows you to, one, pick a grip that could be shoulder width for you, but also allows for some internal rotation to occur. That's pretty ideal. And it's bilateral, so you're also can create a little bit more stability, but also it's a time efficiency standpoint, because that's the issue with me. When I get to the end of the workout, it's hard for me to do like one arm on everything for every, it's like I just want to do some like bilateral movements and be convenient with time.
Yeah, that's where the spud bar comes in, because those hooks allow for the same thing, right? Those spud hooks allow for that internal rotation and then just straight on extension from there. And I think there's a lot of value within having some sort of variable setup for that push down. And then
that's a good tip on those, because you showed me those spud straps
yes.
For push downs, which if you're not watching the video, it's basically just like a toe strap. You stick your hand in and it braces the bottom of your palm. So it takes it instead of loading like the whole palm itself, like with a prime handle or D handle, if you get really beat up in your forearm flexors and you just want to take like a moving part away and be more braced, those are awesome to do. And I kind of use, even if you don't have those straps, it's just a loop of nylon is all it is. So it's something you could probably pick up at Home Depot and do it that way. But yeah, those are great, from limiting some extra stress and getting in a good position that feels comfortable.
I think one value too is like having that bilateral pattern, but also doing like a day where you do have the single arm push down, because for your stronger individuals, so like people more intermediate, there can be some bracing things that like on a push down that kind of limited on like a bilateral.
Right. You're right. It turns into like ab work, right?
Yeah, you're like trying to lean into it just to stay on it. And so like, and then you progressively see over the block, like as the load goes, the person starts leaning and leaning and leaning.
It's
like how much did you actually progress versus just counterforce the weight more? But so I think there is a value if time efficiency isn't an issue in like a single arm push down for that standpoint, because we can positionally stay in a better spot for the most part. And I'll use those spud straps for that too, just for that same like trying to limit flexor involvement.
Well, I think that's probably like for anyone that has gym access, like that setup could work anywhere. A single arm push down, like almost every gym I've ever been to has a cable and a D handle. If you do have the straps, cool. If not, a D handle would perfectly work fine, and you can easily set up yourself to where you're right in the right position to align that cable with how that arm's going to move. So yeah, it's a great setup to do. And that's what's been able to allow me to keep training triceps. And that's what I do. I'll do bilateral one day, and the other day I'll do like a single arm pattern. And I still, depending on what day it is, I might have the push down variation first, and then on the other day it might be like a JM press. On the JM press though, I'm moving from like my other like heavier pressing days. So the triceps already have gotten quite a bit of work in. So the elbows feel good moving to it. The other day I don't have as much pressing. And so I'll do like the push down first.
Yeah.
So just one way to work with it. And then there's on that other day too, I don't have like any type of really that much overhead stuff. So I don't know, it works out programming wise. But anyway, talking about overhead pressing, um, I still think you like doing the incline, or do you do it on incline, the dumbbell extensions?
The skull crusher extensions,
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
do
yeah.
it on the incline relative to the access I have.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
like flat if you don't have a whole lot of access so that you can stay a little bit over the shoulder joint, and then progressively more incline the more access you have. More for gaining that shoulder stability, right? So where the extreme would be literally sitting in something that's like our chair and doing that single arm skull crusher from behind the head. Not only for training that triceps in a stretch position, but for the crossover transfer into overhead pressing, because developing that stability capacity in the overhead position.
Yeah, and I guess I won't make this a tangent at all, but some issue around your arm training and your arms not growing could be your lack of shoulder stability. So to be able to lock down the shoulder and create output in the muscle you're tending, you need to be braced. So if you lack function if you get like overhead with something and you're like shaky with it, it's probably an issue that needs to be addressed. And so what we're talking about here, like getting in like that overhead tricep position, helps you train that function, but you probably also need some functional aspects of training to strengthen those rotator cuffs and stabilizers, your sartorius, not your sartorius, your anterior serratus, and everything that would stabilize your shoulder. You need to strengthen them in different planes so you can once you get in those other positions, you can put good output there. But that could be an issue. I know in my left shoulder, I have less stability within it, and I can tell my bilateral movements, it's an issue, and it'll be lagging. And I also happens to be like a little bit smaller shoulder and my little bit smaller arm. And so this directly gets into like, hey, if your arms are weak, maybe you can train all you want, but you're just not being able to even direct the force through, or it could be neurological and there's some nerve entrapment or something going on with that, or it's just been down regulated to protect and guard against the area because it's not stable. So gaining stability would be huge if you're noticing, especially asymmetry within arms, but in general, it's stuff we should be doing, we don't do as bodybuilders. But so getting in these positions like Luke's talking about, like an overhead tricep extension, it would train that capacity to some extent and help develop that strength. And now, Luke, I'd say like getting in that dumbbell position on a bench, I'm still internally rotated, and it's like I can't keep my elbow directly up. I can't get that full like external rotation of the shoulder. Where do we move from there?
Probably the cable overhead
Yeah.
set. Yeah, that's my preference, because I can just put my torso in the position where it directly aligns with the cable and extend from there. That's actually the variation I'm running right now.
Yeah, so you could even move like a military bench up to the cable if you want to do like seated and more braced, but it's usually such light loading. You can just stand and brace, and then I think you get that extra ability of like training the core slightly, without taking away from a movement pattern. But yeah, I would assess like what can you get to overhead, and set your cable up exactly like that, and move through that exact range with just grabbing the cable in place. And I really like those. I think I've heard someone call them like sword draws or something before. Have you heard them call that like samurai pulls or something?
No, that's what I start writing them in my programs at.
Yeah, it's a badass way. Like single arm cable overhead. You're like, that sounds too like pink dumbbell, like Joe Bennett would say, right? But we go, no, they were doing samurai pulls. You're like, yeah.
Oh man, we kind of touched on it as we walked through this podcast, but I do think there's some value in talking about programming, just like how we are programming it.
Yeah, no, definitely that like I think hits on improving your set quality.
Yeah, for sure.
As a start point, right? So if your arms aren't growing, are you getting quality arm training already? And I think improving your movement patterns, making sure you're selecting the ones that are going to be best for you, for your alignment. So run that first in what you're currently doing. And then also we should look at like the actual session design with training weak body parts and that weak body part in general, and then of course like the split over the week.
Yeah. I even lean towards people that I know have addressed the execution side, not overly jumping straight to an arm day. Just because I think there's a lot of room within just general program design to bring frequency up, where we can kind of take care of the volume metric there. I mean, it's the same concept me and you talk about with like shoulder training. It's like they're smaller, they can pretty much take a beating as long as joints are holding up fine. Like we can probably run the frequency card here, and just start to train them on days that you typically would. So like, if we're starting to talk about pulling a volume card within programming outside of the confines of our normal setups for arm training, I'm starting to place it in areas like leg days, where it's like, what's 3 sets of a curl, 2 sets of a curl before we go train legs? Probably nothing relative to diminishing performance within leg training.
Yeah, no, I would agree there. And I think you have to start looking at like your volume. Like you had it laid out by body part, right? How many sets you have to do for adequate biceps, stimulus for the week, whatever it is, 10 sets.
Yeah.
Just think of it. How do you arrange that to give enough output and stimulus on a day? And then do you need more frequency to recover? Or if it's so much in one day, maybe you need to have it on another day. And that's when you move to that second day of training. So I think getting outside of like, well, this is push day and I only train push muscles on that day. It's like, we're not training just movement patterns. It's just, how do you want to arrange the volume? And it has to make sense though, too, because some stuff doesn't pair well. And then it's hard to flow through some certain aspects. But with arm training, it's pretty quick to warm them up and you can really lay it out to where it can be effective. So I think, for one, if you already have a setup, then having usually it's arm training on the end of your compound work, and that's usually how we do it. I would typically never put it in the beginning ever. It's going to take away from the big picture of what you really want, the big ticket items of like chest, delts, back. So you probably already have some tacked on to the end of a session. If we need to bump it up, if it's low within that session, I still think that would be like a starting point. And so it depends what you're doing. Usually we're running like a push-pull leg type setup. So you're already training arms probably every 4 to 5 days. Mm-hmm. If that's not enough, and you do notice that at the end of your push or your pull session, the fatigue is higher, the set quality is just low, like you're not really getting pumps, that might mean to move some of that volume to the beginning of another session. And that could easily enhance the quality of that volume. So that's a whole thing of like volume quality. It's not that you might to do more, like how do we make it even better? Well, you can put it at the beginning of the session. So yeah, like Luke said, you could add some bicep work at the beginning of legs. And that is like the DC like setup, how I used to run it. It was like a bicep move, a forearm move, calves, hams, quads. I wouldn't train it like that for like necessarily with calves in there before my leg work, but that was the idea. And it was so like low tax movements, to do prior to legs. I feel like if it was really an issue, you could probably do like a bicep and a tricep push down, and the tricep push down would be like, and I would have it to where like that day would be like a little bit higher reps, so you could get in, have some stimulus, but it's not going to carry over into impact your pushing days. And that way you get like some extra tricep work. Because I know you hear people talk about biceps in the beginning of legs. It's like, well, where do I put my extra tricep work? It's like, well, yeah, okay, on pull day, it might affect pull downs, or you won't want to put it first. Your push days, you don't want to put it first there. And so like, well, should I do another day then? It's like, well, we don't want to do another day just yet. I think you could easily do like 3 sets of biceps, triceps, like superset them, knock it out, and then go into your leg work from there. I think as a start point.
Yeah, what I've done in the past, just depending on how the program's set up, is like before quads, a bicep movement, and then before hams, a tricep movement. So that
Okay, if you had a split leg day, yeah.
if you have a split leg day, like doing it that way will kind of help with getting that extra day in. But I do think one thing is like that can affect quality is exercise sequencing or ordering. Like how many times have you tried to do a fucking push down after doing a lateral? Oh my God, trying to keep your shoulder locked down to output with your tricep is the worst feeling in the world. So like not stringing like 3 sets of 15 and 20 on a lateral straight into a push down. Like there's some value in like thought processes like that that can also improve quality.
Yeah, just the flow, right? I mean, so if we're at that point, right, we already have our volume laid out there. We can't do any more arm work before legs. Do we now justify the actual arm day? Because at some point your session might get too long, and you need to break it up. And you'd have to look at probably how where your rest days are and what that initial setup is, and where can you move it to where it wouldn't maybe be as impactful as taking volume away from their areas. Because if you add an arm day in, a whole nother day of training, you're going to spread out the rest of your training sessions. So you're training push every 5 days or something. Well, you're going to move it now to every 6 days. So you are in turn dropping volume across your split for the week, lower, net, essentially less frequency, less stimulus occurring. So you are in a way deprioritizing other muscle groups to add in this extra arm day.
I think that's where the conversation goes. I was going to say what I do a lot of times, and this is actually in like a part of my program, is like a shoulder arm day where it's like modified push more than anything. It's like shoulder work, one chest movement, and then arm work.
Yeah.
But that's typically off the back end of saying, I'm going to put chest a little bit more on the back burner. And so that's kind of where the conversation starts to go for me is like, we can't prioritize everything. We have to make some decisions. And like for me right now, we both agreed that like my chest took such a leap forward this past all season that it's now like a pretty dominant body part. And it's like, let's devote a little bit more time to shoulders and arms. And I'm only doing like for example, in my program, it's like that day goes dumbbell lateral, overhead press, close grip compound, so a tricep based compound. And then there's like a pec fly somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And that's the only chest work that's in there. And the rest of it's shoulders and arms.
Yeah. So I think you could modify some sessions, or if you had off days that were there, because for a while I ran like a push pull off, legs off. It's like, okay, I don't want to change the frequency. I can just move some stuff into like that one of those off days, and it'd be like a shorter workout. So hey, these movements that my push day is like almost an hour and a half long. I can move some of that into my off day, and maybe start there as a way to rearrange volume quality. But I could also make it to where if I need more work, I can put more work there. And following a pull day, I would probably do it to where it's like some delt and triceps on that day, and then I have the biceps on leg day, so it's not off the back end of pull, something like that. But I think that's where you could have essentially you would have pretty much an arm day without affecting the rest. I think if you're highly advanced and you're truly like, hey, I'm complete and I only need arms, well, yeah, everything else can be deprioritized, and you could have like a straight up arm day. And I would have it to where you would make sure you trained arms probably 3 days a week. I would say triceps is the one thing that you might have to debate only doing twice. It just seems like it takes a little bit less than biceps does. I think primarily maybe potentially because you can load it so much in pressing, versus how it gets loaded in your pulls. So yeah, that's just a consideration. If you are highly advanced, yeah, you should be deprioritizing muscle groups. And I do something similar in a way because I have to prioritize, especially if you have weight requirements. So like leg volume right now, is at just 5 sets of quads and hams. But for me, it's chest, delt, and triceps. That's what I need. So at the lower volume in other areas to be able to add more volume in the areas that I want and be able to recover. And I have like my own, like I have a push day, a pull day. That's now it's like a back ham because I just have those few sets on the end of my pull. And then another back leg day that's a little bit of back, a little bit of quad, but it's easy to recover from. And then I'll have a more of a, it's like a push day with delt emphasis. So, and that's a good setup right now. We'll see if it leads to me coming out the back end of off season with the areas that I want. But again, it's an initial setup, guys. So you set it up, you run it, and you can adjust after a block. I think we can spend a little bit too much time in front of the computer screen and paper of writing down the perfect plan. This is me. I will have it like thinking, going through the session in my mind, writing it out. And eventually you go through it and then you're like, oh shit, that didn't work. I just have to modify it. So you just run the session and you'll know how you need to change it kind of intuitively. So, and then after a few weeks, hey, if it wasn't quite right, adjust it. It's okay. You know, don't get bogged down by trying to set up the perfect thing on paper.
Yeah, I think that's like a good way to kind of wrap it up too. It's just like apply, adjust, and kind of move from there. I ain't not gonna lie, you send me those programs sometimes. I just see you sitting there like in front of the computer, like rocking back and forth because you're so aggravated with writing the plan. You're like, fuck it, Luke, just look at it.
Yeah, I finally. Well, it was funny because I had this last split. I had Luke critique and look over and make sure I wasn't crazy. Was calves and abs was driving me crazy to program because I want abs. Then you're like, well, I want enough calf too, and then you're getting to the point of like, well, I want everything to grow. So it's like, how do I set this up to where it makes sense, and then train abs before leg? That you're going through all this stuff in your head. And it's funny because that's what like kind of bogged me down at looking at it, not the priority muscle groups or the muscle groups I wanted to deprioritize or anything. It was like the little nuanced stuff. But no, you're absolutely right. Like it's easy to get pretty bogged down looking and programming out.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think that wraps it up, man. I think that's
yeah. Let us know if you have questions on arm training. And you can leave them down in the description below. Happy to always answer those for you. If you are listening on not YouTube and can't comment, or on Spotify or Google Play, wherever you're at, thanks for listening. But you can also check out our applied hypertrophy module. And that takes you through exactly what we're talking about here. So how to set up in the gym, look for your alignment. What does the muscle do? Then find the pattern that fits within that. And we go through every exercise that Luke and I think would be more optimal choices, but also give you other options within those choices too for your access to equipment and probably within your ability, and also within needing like a regression or a progression pattern. Maybe this is just too simple of an exercise. I need something more challenging. So we go through all that. So check it out. It's 12 lectures and we go through every single body part. And that is on j3university.com. But anyway, guys, until next time, we appreciate you listening and we will talk to you then.